It's important to bookmark a few of the things Donald Trump has said here. Remember, back in January, this was not an issue. It wasn't going to be an issue at all for America. It was totally under control. This sort of reimagining of where the line is here. Now, if there are 100,000 deaths, Donald Trump says that would be a good result because 2 million or more would be a bad result. He's just setting himself a new target here. Is this really going to work in terms of the politics he's playing?
He's playing, look, he faces this crisis in a situation unlike Scott Morrison here in Australia, Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, in that he's facing re-election in November. And so the political overlay of this in the United States is profoundly different from other Western English-speaking democracies, if you will. The campaign ads are cutting themselves at the moment, Tom. You only have to go back, as you did in the introduction, to go back to those earlier pronouncements about Trump. We've got one case, we're on top of this, Larry Kudlow's pronouncements, and watching them slowly move to a tragic concession that the United States could well see fatalities rivaling on a per capita basis what we're seeing in Italy. And the idea an incumbent president of the United States takes 100,000 to 250,000 fatalities as good news heading into his campaign for re-election. We don't know. We've never been in that situation before, Tom, and how this plays out in November, I think, depends on how accurate is that fatality count. And I also would point out, sorry, Tom, just that this is going to depend a lot on how it maps geographically. Donald Trump won in 2016 by picking the lock of the Electoral College, winning narrow victories in a set of Midwestern states. And I think the fatality count in New York and the tragedy unfolding there in California as well, those states were locks for Democrats. Donald Trump's fate turns on, I think, the progress of this pandemic and its political management in 4 or 5 key states in the upper Midwest, where I think we just don't know yet how that will play out.
Yeah, well, once it gets personal for voters there, if it becomes widespread, as you say, and voters get personal experience with this, well, even then, or at that point, even Donald Trump could be held to account for some of those early comments and reactions. What about the meaning for Australia and the rest of the world? I mean, the US is still this huge economy that can have such a big impact. If it really does go into a full-blown crisis, it doesn't really matter how well we manage things in Australia. It will help for the health of the nation, but the economy is going to be in trouble.
Yeah, and there's a knock-on effect through China as well. It's US consumer demand that bumps up China's demands for raw products. That in turn is a good news story for commodity exports and other exports, for that matter, out of Australia. That the integrated nature of the global economy and a long-term downturn in American domestic demand is, I think, perhaps one of the biggest pieces of the economic story here. Already today, I think, as they're recognizing the depth of the public health crisis in the United States, there's also in Capitol Hill a recognition that they need to perhaps go back and go harder than they already have on helping to shore up consumer demand, job protections, and the sorts of things we're seeing governments around the world roll out at massive scale. I think there's this understanding on Capitol Hill as well that if we're talking 100,000 to 250,000 fatalities, boy, oh boy, the economic response perhaps needs to rise to that challenge as well. And again, we don't know, Tom, but I think you're absolutely right to point to that as a direct effect to Australia in terms of our first-order economic relationship with the United States, but the second-order route that comes to us through what it might mean for demand out of China.
Can I get your thoughts just in 30 seconds or so, Simon, on possible escalation of tensions? We've heard the rhetoric around US and China on COVID-19. We know the trade tensions are there. Could this get worse?
Yeah, absolutely, it could get worse, and there's a lot of name-calling and back and forth right now. And again, the political context of the United States helps to underscore why this is happening, looking for offsetting some of the blame for the management of the crisis in the United States. China didn't tell us exactly what they knew at the time. But this is adding another dimension to great power rivalry at the moment, to be sure, both in a PR sense. China is out there parading its credentials as a good global citizen right now with a lot of exports of medical equipment. And it's also making the battle lines clear on supply chains and resilience. And so what was already a tough issue, I think this crisis is, in the short term, making it harder day to day. But I think just raising the stakes, people understanding there are different dimensions to what we were talking about in great power rivalry and what decoupling means and what it perhaps should mean. And all that is simmering away in the background as well. And I think with really important medium-term consequences that we'll get to once we get through the public health crisis.